All right, folks. After almost, well, actually a little over 24 hours of arm wrestling with this computer, I think I've got things kind of evened out. So I'm going to do the lecture from yesterday in two components. This will be the about the chapter on economics, and then I'll do a separate one for the subsistence chapter. But this covers the chapter out of the textbook focusing on economic anthropology, which is a branch of the field that studies how people work to obtain material necessities. By this, we mean things like food and clothing and shelter, primarily water as well, would fall into that. And all people obviously require these. There are very set, fairly short time periods in which people can survive without, well, obviously food and water are a big one, but shelter is also really significant. It's very easy to die of exposure within a few hours in some situations. And so all cultures have ways for people to meet these requirements. But the way in which they meet those requirements is very culturally bound. And what is considered an appropriate way to meet those requirements is also very culture driven. And so economic anthropology basically studies differences in the way in which people meet these needs around the world. Now, since we call it economic anthropology, that begs the question, what is the difference between this field and economics, which is, of course, its own discipline? And there's some pretty stark differences. And we could say that economic anthropology kind of encompasses economics. Economics really focuses only on market exchange. And we'll get to that later in this lecture. Which is one aspect of what economic anthropology deals with, particularly when we talk about modes of exchange. So economic anthropology will deal with much larger questions focused not just on exchange, but also production and consumption as well, and not strictly from a monetary standpoint. Economics also pivots around the notion of rational self-interest, and you see this a lot if you ever put on CNBC or any kind of financial channel. They're basically the profit-driven understanding of the way in which the world works is really fundamental to economics. There's a strong belief there that people always work on a very individual basis to maximize the amount of return through economic activity while minimizing the costs. You're trying to make money without spending money to the best of your ability. And economics will leverage a lot of mathematical models and other sort of quantitative approaches to achieve efficiencies within that mindset. And economic anthropology understands that, but it understands that as one distinct culture of economic activity, one grounded very much in a capitalist worldview, and a very specific form of capitalist worldview. But economic anthropologists will also point out that that is not how people universally make economic decisions around the world. There are things that like cultural values, kin networks, spiritual beliefs, a lot of other things that come into play in other contexts that aren't the sort of, it often gets called essentially, sort of a rational approach to business and commerce. And economics also significantly is what we refer to as a normative discipline. By doing a lot of complex mathematical modeling. Essentially what they're trying to do is, economists try to do, are find ways that people should behave to maximize their efficiencies. And they do this based on or is believe that this is done based on a complete understanding of costs and benefits, and that outcomes are fundamentally predictable based on essentially a scientific scrutiny of past events. And also suggests that people are free to select among alternatives, that they have what anthropologists call agency to make their own decisions and make their own path in the world. Anthropologists focus less on that sort of normative, prescriptive, the way the world should work idea, and focus more heavily on documenting how people actually behave. So it's not a case of should, it's what do people do, and they in studying people and what people actually do and what they say their motivations are. Economic anthropologists much more commonly believe that people make economic decisions not from a position of fundamental understanding and knowledge, but very commonly from a place of, if not complete understanding, sometimes verging up to ignorance, and that there are things that affect individuals to the point to where decisions are not always made completely freely. Culture sets boundaries on alternatives to the point to where people feel compelled to go in one direction. And it's not, you don't have complete agency or complete free will to make whatever economic decisions you want. Now, the chapter breaks down to focus on three different real phases of economic activity. So we're going to start first by looking at production, which is simply turning raw materials into finished goods. We're going to look at exchange, or the distribution of finished goods among peoples, and then we'll finish up talking briefly about consumption, simply using material goods. So it's making, distributing, and then using things. When we talk about modes of production, these are basically the social relations through which human labor is used to transform energy from nature using tools, skills, organization, and knowledge. And so this is how do you take raw materials and turn them into some kind of finished product, be that an agricultural crop, a machine, a research report. How do you produce things from a raw material standpoint? And this classification of different modes of production is something within archaeology, within anthropology, that was heavily associated with an anthropologist by the name of Eric Wolf, who focused significantly on what he termed peasant studies. I think that title sometimes carries a level of a sort of pejorative aspect to it that I don't think is necessarily what Eric Wolf meant, but you see that used a lot. And Wolf himself is heavily influenced by Karl Marx, who was a mid-19th century social theorist who's arguably best known for his book, The Communist Manifesto. And is a guy who communist countries in the 20th century leaned very heavily on his work. And Marx was focusing significantly on industrialized nations. And Wolf and other economic anthropologists have done a lot of application of Marx's work within industrialized countries, but then have also extended it out to look at non-industrialized situations as well. And it's interesting. Marx himself was interested in non-industrialized countries when he was doing his own research, but he really was interested in them as essentially creating a timeline where people would start off in sort of a domestic mode of production and then move to more of a tributary style and then capitalist production. And Marx thought that eventually capitalism would give way to communism. That was basically the thrust of his uh, uh, most celebrated works. And there's an almost evolutionary sort of philosophy to that, which I think from the 21st century standpoint, while we still see a lot of these different modes of production around the world, when you see domestic production taking place, that's not an undeveloped pre-stage to capitalist production or tributary production. Is simply something that exists alongside. Um, there's not a you shouldn't think of people who practice domestic production as being less advanced or less culturally developed than people engaged in, say, capitalist production, which is a philosophy that's been with us, particularly in the United States, for uh, better part of our history. Um, but Wolff essentially broke down production into these domestic, tributary, and capitalist forms, with domestic being basically family or was sometimes called kin ordered production. So located very much to the household and typically, devoid of social domination between families. I forgot to turn off my ringer, and that's my sister. All right. And, um, as in situations where you get some level of political stratification, you often will find tributary production. And this is the production basically is still primarily done through through family groups, but a portion of that labor or the goods they produce is given to a leader who uh, controls and oversees production on a community level through political, religious, or military force. And then finally, the sort of most complex form is capitalist, the capitalist mode of production. And this is where you have private property owned by members of a capitalist class. And that private property, it's important to understand, I think a lot of people, when they see critiques of capitalism that invoke the term private property, they draw a distinction between, or they don't draw a distinction that Marx frequently did. And Marx drew a distinction between private property, which are things that people own, but they don't necessarily use on a day-to-day basis. So this would be things like, factories and say ships used to transport merchandise back and forth. These are not something that's sort of essentially your everyday carry kind of items or the house that you live in. These are things that you use to produce goods. Sometimes referred to as the means of production. Marx also wrote about personal property, which would be more your clothes, your house, the things in the house. And so personal property, Marx didn't really have much to say about, but private property, Marx essentially looked at. Marx another critiques of capitalism. When it comes to private property, there's these sort of large productive facilities that are owned by capitalists, basically the elites within a society. That within capitalism, you have all the means of production are essentially owned by capitalists, which means that workers only can sell their labor to capitalists to survive. And capitalism, unlike the other other two modes of production is focused on producing a surplus um, that can either be retained as profit by the capitalist or reinvested in the means of production to generate further surplus down the road. Now, to dive a little deeper, domestic production is something we see typically with groups that practice foraging. So this will tie into our subsistence lecture, which you can pull up in our next video. And typically small scale subsistence farmers. So these are people who essentially are focused on providing their own needs. They're trying to generate essentially just enough food for the family to keep everyone alive, to keep them fed. There is not a real focus on producing a surplus. And your book has a really nice example of corn farmers in Mexico and Central America, where families work together to essentially produce a crop year after year. The men clear the fields in the forest. They do a lot of the tending of the plants and the garden plots. They have the children around to keep birds and other pests away from the plants. And then once everyone participates in the harvest, but then women oversee drying and shelling the corn and grinding it into meal. So everyone contributes. Everyone is part of the process of producing food in this instance, and that food is basically intended only to feed the members of that family. It could be extended family, so we're talking a dozen to 20 people sometimes, but those communities are basically kin focused. So there's blood ties that keep it together, and it allows for the pooling of resources. And this is particularly important with foragers when it comes to hunting and gathering food. So if the norm is to share the things that you acquire, then it can be a really good buffer for, say, unsuccessful hunts or failed crops. If you come home empty-handed, but one other member of the community has felled a deer or something like that, everyone shares, and so everyone survives. It's not as individualistic as we often see in, say, capitalist economies. Now, tributary production exists in societies I mentioned before that have ruling and subordinate classes. These can be things like elite lineages or elite families. There can be multiple social category or multiple sort of tiers within society, but there will necessarily be a split between the majority. We're essentially seen as commoners and elites, and the actual production of the food, the actual transformation of raw materials into things still happens primarily in kin-focused communities. It happens on that sort of low level where the producers retain ownership of the means of production, but then some portion of the produce or some measure of labor is provided to the elites in form of tribute. And this is something that's very old. This goes back, even speak the words, paying tribute, essentially like, giving up something of value in recognition of an elite's social standing. We do this with more than just finished goods. You think, paying honor to someone is, say, we're paying tribute to such and such a person through such means. That's essentially, giving recognition of someone's vaunted social status through the offering up of a thing. And so frequently this is giving up a portion of crop to an elite. And the elite in this case, typically within those societies, is involved in the uh, coordination of production on a community level. And so what they essentially give back is uh, 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 coordination and overall recognition. And so this can also be a handy means of buffering against shortfalls, in that while elites typically keep most of the tribute for themselves and their own consumption, if you have a community that it finds itself in want of food, commonly those elite leaders will redistribute some of the food to those other areas. And so you have essentially larger geographic scale buffering taking place. And that can be really, really important for maintaining the health of a community. Now, it's important to reiterate here that within tributary production, the means of production, so the farm implements, the land, all the things that people use to actually produce goods, are maintained in the hands of the people who do the work. And that's a big separation from what we see with capitalist production. And this is, your book says this is the youngest form of production, and they say that this is rooted in the 17th or 18th centuries. It actually goes back, we can see its roots in the 15th century. And it's essentially when you get Western Europeans spreading out to colonize the globe, moving, first into Africa and then the New World, that you get first essentially what's called mercantile capitalism, and then market capitalism develops out of that. So there's a heavy tie between Eurocentrism and colonialism and capitalism historically. And the key distinction between capitalism and other modes of production are that the means of production, the factories, the tools, the farm implements, are typically owned by the capitalists, not the people doing the work. And so, you think if you were to go to work at, say, the aluminum plant here in Magnolia, you don't own you don't come in with like a stock of aluminum ore. You don't own the tools that are used, the machines that are used to produce picnic tables, that kind of thing. That's owned by the company. You come in there basically selling your labor to operate the machines. When it comes to teaching this class, I don't own this laptop. I don't own the information systems that we present the information to you on. That's all owned by the university. Well, two universities in this case. But these are not my personal property. The things I use to produce this class, and what little knowledge I can impart to you, are not. I don't own the means of production here, and so that is a really significant distinction between this and other modes of production. And the relationship between labor and capitalists historically has been very fraught as a result, because the machines require hands to work them, and so the terms under which that labor is brought into a factory or some other productive enterprise are always under negotiation. And if you don't typically in capitalism, the products of the productive process are owned by the capitalists, not by the workers. unless there's some sort of specific profit sharing agreement put in place. And so what this leaves essentially is, it essentially leaves workers with only their labor to bring to the table, which can significantly undercut their power within those labor relations, particularly in societies where you have distinct ethnic divisions. It becomes very easy for capitalists to play different laboring ethnic groups off one against the other. And if one group is being too effective in their negotiations, then they can swap over to bargain with a different group. It's sort of a divide and conquer kind of thing. And it's interesting. One of the things economic anthropologists have pointed out is that while you have typically these three major modes of production, it's quite easy to find examples of different modes of production taking place within the same community. And so while here in the United States, our dominant mode of production is primarily capitalist, there are plenty of examples of domestic production that occur as well alongside it. So these things can all kind of live together. And that's, that aspect of economic anthropology focuses on how things are made. How they're exchanged is another sort of tripartite distinction. And I tend to focus on reciprocity, redistribution, pardon me on that one, and market exchange. So we're going to look at each one of these in detail. So within reciprocity, this is probably a term that's fairly recognizable to you. This is, being in a reciprocal relationship with someone means, things are exchanged in sort of an equal, or, you give something and something is given to you in some means. And this is something that has a really long history with anthropology, and the way anthropologists have studied this in a very structured way for a long time. Your book mentions a guy by the name of Marcel Mauss, who did a lot of work on gift giving. And Mauss was an early 20th century French anthropologist who earned recognition in part, because he did good and interesting work that a lot of people still refer to. But he's also one of the few of the generation of French anthropologists who were young men in the early 20th century who managed to survive the First World War. He was a veteran who came home and was able to essentially, make it out of the Western Front intact, which sort of unfortunately set him apart from most of his pre-war colleagues. And his research in anthropology included a work that was in French titled Essai sur le don, which is in English basically has been translated as The Gift. And he's very interested in the question of why do we feel obligated to give some kind of gift back when we receive a gift. And so he was very interested in looking at the gift giving process and what that said about humans and said about cultures and specifics. And he and other people who work in this area, emphasize that gifts are not really terribly about the material thing itself. It's about the social relations and the values and beliefs and power reflected in the process of giving a gift that is really important. And that process of giving things and receiving things is essentially reciprocity. And we talk about different kinds of reciprocity that break down largely along lines of social solidarity, or familiarity in essence, and the degree of expectation of a return gift. And so Uh, one end of the spectrum is what we call generalized reciprocity. And this is where you, this is gifting without keeping a strict accounting of the items exchanged or really having an exact expectation of what we will get in return and when. And this happens in the closest social relationships. So, relationship instances of the highest social solidarity. And so, within families or between really close friends, giving a gift to a family member is typically not something where um, what you give is really, really highly scrutinized. And there's not a lot of balancing of, well, did the gift that I received, is that equal to the gift that I gave, last time? Um, if you're uh, if you give your parents, a $20 gift card and they give you $100 worth of PlayStation games, um, you know, your parents probably aren't going to run away and sulk. Um, but this is, uh, so that there's not generally as much, sort of weighing of the values of items in generalized reciprocity. And if you give a close friend, a say like a T-shirt because because they you think they'd like it, generally they're not going to be, really nervous to make sure that they give you a t-shirt of equal value back within a certain period of time. That there's the closeness of your friendship mediates that expectation remarkably. Um, More socially distant and more highly structured is something called balanced reciprocity. And this is a form of direct exchange where something of known value is given with an expectation that something of equal value will be returned within a certain period of time. Um, so the typically this is something done in a a situation that is more socially distant. So it'll be an acquaintance, not a family member, but it'll be someone who you want to maintain a relationship through giving these gifts back and forth. And so, um, the typically a gift will be very carefully selected. There will be some level of ceremony in the gifting process, and then there is an expectation that the social statement made through giving that gift will be returned at some point in the not too distant future by something of equal value. And so your book points to the Kula ring, which we discussed at least once earlier in the semester. This is Bronislaw Malinowski and his work in the 19 teens on the Trobriand Islands, which studies the movement of these arm shells and necklaces around the Trobriand archipelago, basically, a network of islands that people move these items back and forth in circles. And so the every trader within the Kula ring has trading partners on the next islands that he will move either arm shells or necklaces to. And these items that are being traded have their own value, but really what is important is maintaining the social link through the process of gifting. And so when people travel to make these exchanges, they are going to pay some level of attention to their trading partner. Typically, there are other goods that are traded alongside these sort of high status items. And so it is the social link that is maintained through this balanced reciprocity between people who are familiar and longtime acquaintances and friends. Some of these trading relations endure for years and years and years, but they're not family members. There's more of a social gap between the people. Right. And then farther down the spectrum is what's called negative reciprocity. And this is typically situations where you have the least social solidarity. So this can be things happening between absolutely complete strangers, and um, the expectation here is to try to essentially to get something uh, for as close to nothing as possible. So you're not only are you not giving something with no expectation of getting something, or giving something with expecting to get something of equal value back. You're trying to get all the value without having to give anything. Um, and so you typically do this with people that you have no real connection to. Um, you don't do this with close family members or close friends. Um, and so things like gambling would be an instance of negative reciprocity. You're uh, trying to maximize your return with absolutely no outlay if you can avoid it, which sounds a lot like market exchange, which kind of is. And but it goes even further. So your book has the example of Nigerian email scammers, uh, being essentially folks who are trying to get money out of dupable Westerners, um, for essentially no monetary outlay on their own. So theft is a form of negative reciprocity. Going in and raiding someone else's community, through violent attack, is a form of negative reciprocity. You are simply taking without giving. Um, so that's very, very far removed from this, generalized reciprocity. So another mode of exchange we refer to as redistribution. And this is essentially the accumulation of goods or labor by a particular person or institution for the purpose of dispersal at a later date. And this happens in all form of production, but uh, is typically requires some sort of degree of social stratification beyond like a household level. So, um, in domestic production, you'll find this, essentially at a household level where, people pool resources and say parents, apportion out food to children at like the dining table. But in say a tributary system, the elites will take in the the tribute and then redistribute it when needed. In capitalist production, things like taxes are a form of redistribution, either coming back to people as tax returns or tax refunds, or federal services like infrastructure, building roads, building and at least partially funding schools, and police and fire. All these things are what come back to us for the payment of taxes. And your book also mentions a phenomenon called a potlatch, which are they're still actually ongoing. These are things that take place among Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest, so like Oregon, Washington area. And essentially, community leaders would would acquire tribute from the people within their community, and then so they'd accumulate this massive pile of wealth, and then in these big ceremonies would distribute it to both members in the community and also visitors from other communities. And so there became a real focus on showing how much wealth you could give away. There's not not focused on how much wealth you could accumulate and maintain, but how generous you could be with other people. How how many they would exchange everything from pots and pans and blankets and other things to some of the earliest ones. Some of these societies were slave owning, and so slaves would be distributed as well. And so the statement of wealth was not, what you retain, but what you could part with. And um, these were and are huge community events that both bound communities together, because the gifting of wealth from the leaders down to the commoners was significant, but then also that was a way of uh, solidifying political connections between communities. And so, if a community leader invited leaders from other communities to come, those other leaders showed up. That was a recognition of the leadership, a validation of the leadership position of the person holding the potlatch. And so, these were important political events alongside the economic aspects of simply redistributing wealth. All right. And our final mode of exchange are essentially markets. And markets are social institutions that revolve around prices or other forms of exchange equivalencies. These, which basically means that there has to be some way of some means of exchanging things for other unlike items. And this can be, sort of bartering is one form of that. And we'll talk about money in a minute, but that's very common within market economy or market exchange. And a lot of times these will have a specific geographic aspect. And so this, you think like, a street market is, sort of is a low level one of these, but something like, like a stock exchange is going to be a very geographically expansive influencer of a market. Now, it's interesting to note they don't necessarily have to have a geographic aspect to them, particularly in the modern world. A lot of trading has moved online. You may have sort of a hybrid setup where there's an actual exchange floor, but then people can, trade back and forth from their computers, literally all over the world. And some don't really even have that one geographic space. We've seen with the rise of things like cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin. That's very, very. Come on, brain. There's a lot less of a geographic aspect to that exchange. And market exchange is significant in that it separates from other forms of exchange by the existence of the belief in supply and demand. So that's, yeah. That notion of supply and demand governs a lot of economic behavior, and that and also determines employment and engagement within those forms of exchange, which also brings with it the specter of the fact that markets are much more common to find people who are left vulnerable by them. So if you lose your job or are underemployed within a market economy, it's much more common for people to have to worry about meeting their basic needs like food and shelter. This is how you wind up homeless and malnourished. Folks who rely on more reciprocal networks, other redistributive or reciprocal forms of exchange, typically don't have to worry about that. They may not have as high of a ceiling as far as what they can accumulate, but they typically have a higher floor. They don't fall quite as far. And it's important to note also that with market exchange, it's generally less personal than reciprocal or redistributed exchange. The focus really is on exchange at the moment, not future exchanges or past exchanges. History and potential typically is not at the forefront of the organization of those exchange opportunities. And if you think about something like, buying from a supermarket or buying something online, there's very little social engagement. You don't see you're not making a personal relationship there. You're simply exchanging something for another thing, and typically the thing exchanged within uh, market exchange is money. And money is sort of an interesting thing in that it is a medium of exchange that allows you to commensurate different things. So you can set or you can communicate essentially values between two very, very distinct items and compare them. Um, so rather than have to say, I'll give you, uh, three deer skins a um, for a collection of lumber or something like that, you can set each at a monetary price, and that the money can essentially be used to uh, uh, negotiate values between the two. Things can be much more standardized as a result. Um, Money's dead common in market exchange. But what actually constitutes money can be really variable. And this is sort of one of the sort of fascinating things about um, commerce is that people you often if you stay up late enough at night, you'll see advertisements for gold coins because the price of gold is going up, and so you can store a lot of your wealth in gold. And people seem to have this thought that gold is some sort of inherent carrier of wealth, and the only reason that we consider gold to be valuable is because that's a cultural belief. We historically in this country we've had big discussions about using gold or silver as a backer for paper money, but none of those really have value intrinsic to themselves. They're simply cultural points that uh, or cultural beliefs that they have certain values to them. And you go to different places around the world and people use very different things as money and exchange it in the same way, regardless of what it constitutes. And so if you go into the South Pacific, there's an island called Yap, 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 where the coins are basically these large stone discs that can be rolled from one household to the next, as to be exchanged in the way that pocket money, uh, something small enough to actually be put in the pocket is exchanged in the Western world. But the only thing that really separates a 10-foot diameter stone disc from carrying from gold in terms of carrying wealth is simply a cultural point. That's something that I think people sometimes have sort of difficulty wrapping their heads around. So there's nothing outside of culture that determines that gold or silver is more valuable than anything else as a form of money. But finally, consumption is sort of the last phase of economic activity that anthropologists really look at. This is simply the buying, using, or eating of a resource, commodity, or a service. And so anthropologists get really interested in how people consume things consistent with their culture. And so this is something that's really rooted in ideology and identity, because what we consume makes visible really important parts of our culture. And so you're the author of the textbook section says, when they go to a baseball game, they wear a hat and a shirt that have certain colors and logos on them because that shows their identity as both a baseball fan and a fan of that certain team. You think about the clothes that you put on and the symbols literally imprinted upon them, if there are, says something about who you are. If you're wearing a blue shirt with a Mule Rider logo on it, that's you're through consumption, through purchasing or accepting if you're a member of a sports team and it was given to you, that item, and putting it on your person, you're signaling your identity as part of this university community. Um, and that extends to, the food you eat or don't eat can signal parts of religious or personal identity. So anthropologists who focus on consumption look at how we express who we are and who we're connected to through the things that we consume. And they're also very interested in what and how things become status symbols and how we display them. And so, you know, I was talking a minute ago about how, gold is, there's nothing really sort of outside of culture that really dictates that gold is a thing of great value. But once we agree that it is, the display of it in various situations is a very powerful statement about status. It says are someone who has accumulated enough wealth to uh, have gold, and how you display it, you know, can be a very powerful statement about your economic position within society. And if it gets to the point where you can have a gold and diamond and encrusted set of earbuds, that's a pretty pretty effective statement that you've got some disposable income, because that's not something that most people can afford. Um, the ones pictured cost $5,000. Just if you got that kind of money sitting around in your pocket and you really don't want it anymore, there you go. All right, and the last point the chapter makes touches on what we call political economy. And this is a really interesting area of research. And essentially, it looks at how the economy is central to everyday life, but then also how it is contextualized within economic relations, within state structures, political processes, social structures, and cultural values. And basically, what that means is that it looks at how the economy functions across an uneven playing field within society. And so it recognizes that some people have more power than others and can force through various coercive means people to do things or be restricted from things because of their position within society. And over time, economies will constrain people's choices and define the terms by which we must live. And frequently, people, particularly those who are living, subject to not the most elite section of society, will typically come to think of the conditions around them as just the way things are, and that one of the sort of real thrusts of people who study political economy is trying to get people to understand that with changes in levels of power and understanding, we have increasing agency to create change in those conditions. And this includes a really significant emphasis on studying what we call structural violence. And structural violence is something that we contrast against overt violence. So, if two people get in a fist fight, or someone kills somebody else, that is a very overt violent act. And it has obviously very significant and negative impact on the subject. But we also identify structural violence as these, sort of more essentially, structural impacts on people's persons and freedom. And so we look at how social structure both aids or prevents people from meeting their basic needs. And so your book mentions specifically things like infectious disease, hunger, and violence, exposure to violent acts as being things that are significantly affected by, structural, by social structure. And so with like infectious diseases, living in an area where you have limited access to medical care, or working uh, in a position where you don't get health insurance in the, within the way that our healthcare industry is set up. Um, all those things can make you more exposed to infectious diseases, and that is considered a form of structural violence. This places you at a vulnerability that others don't share. Um, the inability, unemployment, inability to find work, or inability to find good paying work, or having access to supermarkets within easy reach that have nutritious food in them, all can contribute to hunger, which is a huge problem in the United States, one of the wealthiest countries of the world, and we have huge numbers of people who suffer from malnutrition. Um, so a lot of anthropologists look at the way in which the economic system essentially creates structural violence through creating conditions that promote hunger amongst our population. Um, so we're gonna wind it up there. We'll get this posted, and then we'll get the subsistence one recorded as soon as I can. So yeah, thanks for listening.